Okay, so shall we begin? All right, we already have a few people. Okay. All right, so first of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who has joined in. Of course, you can turn on your videos if you want to, or you can switch it off. That's not an issue, but please keep your mics on mute. And thank you so much, Marwa, for joining us. And okay,
Thank you for having me.
and so now, so first of all, I'd like to start with International Legal League and what exactly International Legal League is. So basically, we're a group of students from all across the globe. We have formed a uniform team that we aim to actually help students across the globe. We are all a group of law students helping other law students across the globe, especially the ones who are less privileged and cannot get access to resources. So we're basically trying to get in all the resources that we have and compile them so that we can help all the students. And of course, we have our brilliant ambassadors, we have our content writers, researchers, editors, and everyone who's been a part of this. And I'm actually pretty glad to have them on team. Thank you so much. And yes, of course, along with this, welcome again, Marwa. So now I'm moving on to Lavanya and Haris to take over.
Hi, thank you, Shivani, for introducing. I'm Lavanya Shankar. I am the UK Country Ambassador for International Legal League. I will be giving a bit of an intro about myself, and then I will introduce Marva to you today. I'm basically finishing off my master's in law, business, and management. So I've always gone through the conventional route of law, traditionally, and I've worked in various private practice firms. So that ranges from high street to international law firms. So I've basically gained exposure to areas of law such as personal injury litigation, commercial law, a bit of IP, and a lot of business law as well. So very business orientated, I guess you could put it that way. So I hope to obviously become a solicitor. I'm not too far off away. I hope to develop more opportunities in the legal sphere. I'm also a legal tech enthusiast. So I'm also part of different opportunities for legal tech. And I've been in part of a competition. So you might have seen Thought River's blog competition where I was in the top 3 submissions for my blog. It's publisher. Please do check it out on Thought River. So that's me. That's me done. Otherwise, I'll keep on babbling on. So without further ado, I will now introduce you to Marva. So Marva, would you like to start?
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. And I think it's a wonderful project that you have going on. So kudos to you. And I wish you guys all the best. So a little about myself. I actually completed my BA LLB actually a while ago from LUMS Lahore. After that, I worked in the corporate sector for just a little bit. And then I went for my master's to Harvard Law School on the Fulbright Scholarship. And when I returned, I've since then, essentially for the past 5 years, I've been teaching at LUMS Law School, actually. My areas of interest are primarily the constitutional law, a bit of comparative constitution there as well, but more into the constitutional history of Pakistan, the Indian subcontinent, and also human rights. One of the most recent projects I'm affiliated with is the Feminist Judgment Project. So there's a lot of sister projects going on across the world. So it started in the UK, and then essentially we're starting something similar project in Pakistan where we rewrite Supreme Court judgments from a feminist perspective. Other than that, I'm also one of the founding members and the co-editors of the LUMS Law Journal. So sort of a nerdy background to that, but this is pretty much it. So thank you once again for having me.
I thought I would just butt in and say we also have Haris Rahman, who's also in the same country as Marva. So he's from Pakistan. Haris, do you want to let everyone know about yourself?
Yeah, first of all, welcome everyone for joining us. Some of us are here on Zoom and some of us are some of you are on YouTube. So wherever you are from, watching us from, just welcome to the webinar. Um, I want to tell you about myself. I'm Haris Rahman, and I'm currently a rising junior at the Lahore University of Management Sciences in Pakistan. Um, I know today's topic may bring up a lot of questions. Just feel free to drop your questions in the comment section of YouTube or in the chat box of Zoom. We'll try to take as much questions as we can in the given time that we have. Without any further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Ms. Marwa Khan. I hope you enjoy the discussion as much as I do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Will I just take over for him? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I thought I would just mention, sorry, I just thought I would mention, I think Shivani forgot the biggest bit to include. So I'll just let you know on that. Shivani is obviously our founder, our wonderful founder of International Legal League. So just thought I'd throw that in there. I think she missed that bit out. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm keeping it. All right. So thank you so much, Lavanya, for saying that. Yes, I'm the founder of International Legal League. And of course, I have my other team members over here as well. Our country ambassadors, our really wonderful campus ambassadors, and of course, the participants. Thank you, everyone who's watching this on the webinar as well as on the YouTube live. Thank you so much. And yes, over to you, Marwa.
Okay, I think this was a very important piece of information. You were right. So just moving on to other topics. So essentially, when I was contacted to have a discussion with all of you today, I thought about what would be an appropriate topic for today, considering you all come from very diverse backgrounds, not just in terms of your educational backgrounds, but also in terms of which jurisdiction you are, if you belong to. So, and then one topic that I just thought should apply to everybody or should be of relevance to everybody is judicial review. So when we look at judicial review, I mean, of course, the context to that, of course, is that every state is generally divided into three organs. You have the executive, you have the legislature, and you have the judiciary. And today, essentially, I'll, of course, be defining it a little bit, explaining you how that pans out. But what I want to talk more about is the contextual theory that is often neglected when we talk about this topic, because whenever we talk about judicial review, it's either divided amongst, like common law countries versus civil countries, or you look at it from the system where the country has a parliamentary form of government or presidential form of government. And there are a lot of other factors which are very, very important and very, very relevant, which often get left out of the discussion entirely. So today, essentially, I will try to focus more on all of that, as opposed to the more common themes that are very easily accessible and all over Wikipedia and your basic search engines, basically, right? And another reason I want to talk about judicial review is that if you look at the history or the evolution of the judicial system across the world, whether we're looking at it common law systems, civil law systems, I mean, if you go back, even if you move, to a time period prior to the time where you had Westphalian countries actually, or nation states come to light, you had a system, you essentially the world over, you either were part of a monarchy or some form of authoritarian regime like that, whether it was religiously ordained or otherwise, or otherwise you generally belong to a territory which was being governed by a similar nobility or royalty or authoritarian regime somewhere else in the world, right? We're also very much privy to the whole wide time span in our world's history of colonialism, and also hence the consequent spread of common law versus civil law around the world. So we have all of those blends. But one thing that essentially was very consistent for the longest period of time around the world, at least in most territories, was the idea that, I mean, in some countries, the executive was very strong. I mean, of course, historically, of course, that is what it was. And then you had a legislative system develop over time, which started to gain strength over a very slow process, and it evolved into something more substantial. And we had modern day contemporary legislatures come to light. The judiciary, on the other hand, was always envisaged as a very minuscule part of the state. So in many areas, actually, it was associated with the monarchy or with the ruler as well. So the whole idea or the notion of a king's court, I mean, a king's court was also established in England the 12th to the 13th century. If you look at it from the perspective of the Indian subcontinent, even here, there was, if you look at the Mughal era, for instance, there was a notion of the king's court present there as well. And just even if you look at it from the perspective of common law colonies, actually, or colonies which were occupied by the British, what we end up seeing is a system where there were huge overlaps between the executive functionality and the functionality of judicial functions. So there were many areas, for instance, where agents of the executive branch of the state were actually acting in judicial capacities as well. And you might have had certain other areas where somebody who was purely recruited as a judge would carry out judicial functions, but then again, you still had a hybrid of the two systems essentially going on. So the complete notion of judicial independence is fairly recent. Even actually, if you go back to the time when the Constitution of the United States was being drafted, so just to give you guys a little backdrop of those people who don't know, so there was somewhat of a two-party system going on even then, where you had the Federalists and you had the Anti-Federalists. And this is a time where there were written constitutions in smaller territories, but there had never been a written constitution for one entire country as a whole. So it was a very new experience at that point in time. And even then, so if you read all the Federalist papers, which went into the working of and the drafting of the US Constitution, one of the recurrent themes is how the judiciary is the weakest organ of the state. And from that point in time, over the last, let's say a few hundred years, or actually even less, even if you just look at the last century, the role of the judiciary has drastically changed. One of the reasons behind this, of course, is decolonization as well. You had a lot of new nation states come up with their own systems. And of course, there were variances amongst that as well. But one thing that you can see in common across countries at this point in time is that the one factor that played an essential role in the judiciary is becoming stronger is the power of judicial review, right? So with that sort of historical backdrop, now I'll essentially come to, why it's so important, or how essentially it led credence to the judicial systems overall. So when we look at contemporary concept of judicial review in the modern, state structures, we can again sort of trace the dilemma of judicial review back to, let's say, in the contemporary constitutional framework, we can trace it back to, again, the Federalist Papers. For example, James Madison in Federalist Paper number 51 talked about how, just like, he sort of hinted that, this is not going to be a government run by angels, and you do need certain checks and balances. But at the same time, you can't limit the government so much that it cannot effectively carry out the basic functions it's envisaged to do so. And so how do you sort of resolve this conundrum? And the final solution was to empower the third branch of the state, which was the judiciary, to have some form of checks and balances where it could exercise on the other two branches. So overall, so the other two branches, and also in order to just holistically keep a check on the government vis-a-vis the citizens of the state. Because if you compare and contrast the two, the whole notion or the whole idea of a nation state is actually vested in citizens coming together, willfully, giving up or relinquishing certain of their rights, the whole idea of anarchy or might is right, in exchange for the state providing them security and safety and the protection of their other state ordained rights, which are now in the contemporary world also called fundamental rights, or at least within the context of constitutional law, right? So who was empowered to carry out all these protectionist measures, and it was essentially the judiciary. So when we actually look at what judicial review is in very simple terms, we're actually looking at courts exercising their basic judicial power in order to evaluate two types of questions. Number one, they can be questioning the constitutional validity or the legal validity of any particular law. For example, if a new law has been passed, which some people say, let's say, it contravenes some aspect of the constitution, that particular law is going to be deemed as unconstitutional or ultra vires the constitution, which means outside the bounds of the constitution, and that contradictory part essentially is going to be considered void and will not be applicable. So that's essentially one aspect. The other aspect is where the judiciary actually is involved in assessing or evaluating the legal validity of a decision or an action or even an inaction of a state institute or state agent or essentially any state functionary or public office holder who is acting in their official capacity. So whether or not they were legally allowed to or empowered to carry out a certain action, or was there a compulsion on the state to carry out an action which it failed to do so. So all of these things essentially fall within the ambit of judicial review. So the first one, where the first category, where the court is assessing the legal validity of a law, that is essentially considered carrying out judicial review against the legislature, because that is the lawmaking state agent or organ of the state. And the second one, where they're assessing the legality or illegality of an action, inaction, a decision, all of that falls within generally the ambit of judicial review against the executive. And when I say executive, that's essentially again a very contemporary concept, because for a very long time, and of course you can trace judicial review all the way back to like very early courts in England as well. So again, in this sense, I'm talking more in the concept of common law countries, but the same is true for civil law countries as well. So the idea that even where you had king's courts or you had smaller adjudicating bodies which were looking at which were involved in some form of dispute resolution and had some form of state sanctity associated to them, in those situations as well, you did have judicial review powers. The courts did have it, but essentially it was only pertaining to administrative actions. And for those people who are wondering what's the difference, I mean, if judicial review against administrative actions, you can in again very simple terms, is a subset of judicial review against the executive. The executive is the largest branch of the state. So, I mean, of course, at the top, you can have the president or your head of state, whoever that might be, depending on or your queen or the king or whoever. If you are a parliamentary form of government, your prime minister, your cabinet will also be part of the executive. Then you have your entire bureaucracy, you have your military, you have your police. So the overall stance or just the sheer size of the executive body is really large. So initially, for a very long period of time, the courts did not have the power to go against the kings. They could only go against or issue decrees against members of the executive branch, but who were operating at a lower level. So working at the grassroots level, at the administrative level, only that. So the idea that a judicial functionary or a judge for that matter can actually hear a case pertaining to the head of the state or former head of the state, somebody who's appointed at the very top positions, is again a very, very recent phenomenon that we have today. So just to again sort of sum up the few things I've mentioned, judicial review essentially is a core component of the notion of separation of powers. So you have, again, three branches of the state. You have the legislature, executive, and judiciary. And within these three branches, the idea of separation of powers is that the roles must be distinct between these three branches, and each branch should exercise some form of checks or balances against the other two branches. And so the legislature has the purse, which essentially means all the budgetary powers essentially lie with the legislature. The legislature is also passing laws which empower the state or essentially take away state's power and gives it to the citizens. You have the executive, which has the power of the sword, because of course you have the army and the police as part of the executive. And then you have the judiciary, which has no such powers. It has no money allocation powers. It has no brute force of its own. But what it does have is that it can interpret and apply the law, and it can also assess the legality of the actions carried out by the other two branches of the state. And generally, when there's a discussion about, judicial review powers, the first thing that the first sort of aspect people touch upon is whether that country is a common law country or a civil law country, because the idea is that the judges in the common law tradition have a greater role to play when it comes to expanding the ambit of the law, or even coming up with new law, new custom, new legal customs, whereas civil law judges do not have that sort of prerogative and are more restrictive in their interpretation and application of the law. However, I feel personally that this bifurcation is somewhat inherently flawed. I mean, of course, the type of system is essentially going to have an impact on what sort of judicial review powers exist. But there are other things, even with just clubbing all countries together as common law versus civil law countries, I think is also very, very problematic, because within them, within each of the two categories, is a wide range of different types of powers that do exist. Um, so, for example, if we take civil law countries, the fact that judges are not bound by precedents, essentially, unlike their counterparts in common law countries, also sort of gives them an expansive power. So, a common law judge will not have as much room to maneuver if there's already a binding precedent on them on that particular area of law. A judge from a civil law country essentially will have greater directions in that front. Another very important thing that to remember, and essentially this sort of feeds into the latter part of my discussion as well, is the idea that language, which is the core component of law around the world. So it could be, I mean, of course, it could be your national language, official language, whatever you're looking at. Law is dependent first and foremost on language itself. And one integral facet in both systems, common law and civil law, is the evolution of language in relation to evolving social standards and beliefs over a period of time. And one example to explain this would be the notion of what or who is a person. So if you go back a century or so, or even less actually in many areas, the idea of who is part of a person or who can be counted as a person in a legal perspective, a person with legal rights, a person who can carry out legal actions on their own accord. And of course, it's age dependent with the whole idea between a minor and an adult. But in addition to that, it was very, very much restricted to landowning males. And of course, in the West, it was landowning white males. And that essentially was the legal definition and application of the term person. And over a period of time, you had the suffrage movement, and one by one in territories around the world, you had the inclusion of women within the definition of persons. There was the abolition of slavery, that of course expanded the definition of person as well. And more recently, in very contemporary times, also like very, very recently, there is the idea of inclusion of the third gender as well, or gender non-binary persons, also persons with impairment. So the idea that all of these clusters of people deserve not just equality as citizens, but also must also be treated equally in the eyes of law, has evolved over a period of time. So even if so these things also then translate into judicial review, in the sense that when the judge is sitting there and interpreting and applying the law, how they envisage a particular word to be interpreted is also very, very heavily dependent on the social and political surroundings of that particular judge, their biases and everything. So, and this is true across the board. So even in civil law countries and common law countries as well. And, so some of the civil law countries essentially hail that as a very major form of judicial review as well. And something that, and on the other hand, they have that flexibility only because they're not bound by past precedent. So when we talk about common law countries, because the definition of person has been defined, let's say, by a 20-year-old judgment, which is still applicable and still binding to this day, the judges may be more restrictive. So judges who are part of more conservative benches will err on the side of caution and not expand the definition of person, even though sociopolitically that particular definition has changed, and they might essentially consider it as a more of a political question to answer as opposed to anything else. Similarly, and just like feeding into this particular conversation as well, it's also important to see, like you can't also club it together all common law countries as well. So I mean, common law of course originated in England, but if you look at how judicial review, or even just the overall functionality of the judiciary in England, the judges tend to be very conservative. I mean, Lord Denning is very popular, and essentially I've always really enjoyed reading his judgments. Very entertaining, actually, and just like the back and forth he had with the House of Lords often. However, Lord Denning is also that popular because he was truly one of a kind. He was one of those rare judges who was willing to push the bounds of law. He wasn't that conservative, and you don't really find too many of his counterparts, or too many other judges behaving or adjudicating in the same way. Whereas, when you look at, let's say, the American courts, the constitutional courts, of course, is what I'm restricting the conversation to today. So in the in the United States, they essentially have time and again indulged in a lot of important questions. So the idea of legalizing same-sex marriage, for instance, you have that. You have Roe v. Wade. If you go back a little further in terms of the abortion rights, but the general idea, I mean, you do have these very excellent landmark cases, but more often than not, you will also find a very conservative bent there as well. The idea that, and actually not conservative in the sense of their ideological beliefs, conservative in the sense of how much judicial power they're willing to exercise in a given case. So you will often find discussions within cases which say, oh, such and such thing is not something that we will adjudicate upon because it's a political question. And they will just simply leave that bit out and adjudicate on the legal aspects or legal issues of the case at hand. But when you look at many of the post-colonial states, when you look at particularly all the constitutional courts that emerged out of the Indian subcontinent, so you have the Indian Supreme Court, you have the Pakistani Supreme Court, you have the Supreme Court of Bangladesh, you will find a lot more proactiveness from the Supreme Courts, the top constitutional courts in all three countries. Even if you look at other post-colonial common law states, the courts have been rather proactive on various fronts. Even though they have the same colonial history embedded, even though they get the current judicial structure even is very much similar, if not exactly the same, to what was left behind by the British. You still see a lot of proactiveness in terms of, I mean, suo motu power essentially is very, very central to, all the legal debates in Pakistan. And Pakistan sort of roots the emergence of suo motu powers to India, and the idea that the court itself can take notice of a legal action or a legal issue, as even if nobody has formally filed a petition at the very court, right? So now this is something that's quite revolutionary in that sense, and this of course falls within the ambit of judicial review, and this is essentially one of the strongest forms of judicial review you will find in the world today. You will not find the American Supreme Court ever saying that, oh, look, no formal petition has been filed, but nonetheless, we think this is a matter that's of public importance and involves fundamental rights, and we want to assess it. But you have that happening time and again, and most so in Pakistan, I feel, but then India. But essentially, this is a very sort of a common element that we have across the three countries within the Indian subcontinent. So which is why essentially I also feel that, just clubbing together all common law countries and saying, oh, the notion of judicial review is pretty stagnant or consistent within these is also, I think, very problematic from that perspective. In fact, in Pakistan, taking up political questions is what mostly suo motu power recently has been used to do. Something that, like your more Western courts will essentially not even consider that a judge, proper for a judge to undertake, right? So, and, Indian Pakistan have used the notion of basic structure theory, salient features doctrine to actually go on and even challenge the substance of constitutional amendments passed in our countries. So when we're looking at separation of powers, I started off by saying the lawmaking essentially was the sole role of the legislature. And I also discussed briefly that sometimes judges in common law countries are involved in a certain degree of decision making or expanding the ambits of the law. Then we have this particular context. It's a post-colonial scenario where you have judges saying that we are not democratically elected. We are certainly not the lawmaking body of the country. However, nonetheless, we are capable of interpreting and applying the law, and within a certain framework. Of course, it's not like a free fall situation, though. Within the framework of basic structure, salient features, we are also empowered to, look at whether constitutional amendment is problematic or not. And one of the core features, of course, is, let's say, I mean, there are a lot of criticisms that I think you can think of on the go as well. But one thing that they and also a lot of other political legal theorists have essentially used in favor of all of these actions is, what if one day your parliament comes and with, let's say, not even a simple majority, with a super majority or with a complete majority, unanimously say that we are no longer going to be a democracy. Should anybody be able to sit there and exercise a check on that? Right? And if we go back to the historical debates that we've had, I mean, of course, everything, there have to be powers which circumscribe all powers, essentially. So there's a hierarchy or sort of circular argument within law itself. But if we go back to the earlier discussion we were having, the idea that the whole judicial branch, when it was envisaged in contemporary nation states, the whole one major role was, number one, to ensure that the government is restricted, and secondly, primarily in its relations to the citizens. So if the parliament today comes and says that we are abolishing democracy altogether, then that, of course, takes away the rights of the citizens, who may have very legitimately elected those people, but might not have elected them thinking that this is necessarily what they're going to do, right? So they can't single-handedly take away certain things like that. Similarly, what if your parliament comes today, says, oh, we're still a democracy, but having fundamental rights is a huge onus and causes a lot of risks. So we're essentially just going to do away with that one chapter of the constitution. Everything else remains the same, right? So there are certain things which are go to the core of a nation state in itself. And the idea that the judiciaries in, like particularly in the Indian subcontinent, have, sort of adopted this principle that we are also there to protect these certain notions. If something is there to threaten these areas, we will then consequently intervene. The backdrop, of course, would be, even if the judiciary does pass a ruling that something is illegal, in order to enforce that, it needs to rely on the executive branch. So if they're passing a ruling against the executive branch, or the and the legislative branches, and they're not happy with the decision, the judiciary, I mean, of course, can offer contempt notices, send show cause notices also. But beyond that, there's really nothing they can do. They have no brute force. They can't essentially actually pass new law. They don't have any budgetary allocation power. So it's not like they can withhold their budget next time so that they'll be coerced into following the orders. So the judiciary, even though it has become really strong, but it's also become strong because the other two branches let it become strong. I mean, of course, from one country to the other, which branch was more involved in this strengthening of the judiciary will vary. In Pakistan, for instance, because we've had a long history of dictatorial regimes. In our history, of course, the strengthening of the judiciary came through the dictatorial regimes itself. And then, the whole idea that in order to sort of rectify its image in the eyes of the public, the Supreme Court also became more populist. The idea that it wanted to take up more human rights, fundamental rights related cases in order to legitimize itself in the eyes of the public at large. So, sort of becoming the messiah, and then also sort of keep on getting some empowerment from the executive branch itself. So, I mean, of course, contextually, those things have a very strong bearing as well. When we're looking at all of this, of course. And in addition to all of this, so when we're looking at the idea that judicial review is then rooted within the notion of separation of powers, there's also been criticism against the more widespread use of judicial review as well, right? Because again, every time one state organ expands its ambit or expands its powers, it's always at the expense of either the public's rights or the powers and the domain of the other branches. So it's a growing tussle, And in many countries actually at this point in time, there's an equilibrium yet to be reached. So I think which is also why I think it's a very exciting subject, even if I'm boring you, in the sense that we still have to see where it sort of falls. I mean, I could have initially, I thought I could just talk about all the 5 writs you have. You have prohibition, mandamus, certiorari, quo warranto, how they pan out. But then I thought, what's more important and what actually affects the application of these writs in the future is where the judiciary lies going forward vis-a-vis the other branches, and also vis-a-vis the eyes of the public. I mean, if you're looking at judicial review, there are often other things that are ignored. I mean, one, again, recent issue is, or not issue, but factor that's ignored is the advent of social media, right? So the idea that people have become really active in a lot of legal and political debates, even though they weren't. So everybody is posting like either status here or making a video there, or criticizing the state on their own pages or profiles. The idea of having these change.org type petitions that people generally file on issues that are important to them, and these things also affect the state as well, right? Because even though the judges aren't elected and they have tenure, the idea is that everybody likes to be liked. And I think that's one thing that social media has. Everybody likes, right? So like if a judgment of the Supreme Court is being widely appreciated, of course the judges are going to feel happy, right? So it might not necessarily be an explicit bias that they have, or a thing that they're explicitly thinking about, that I must please the public at large. At the back of their heads, this is not a factor that can be ignored. More structurally speaking, though, you have other things as well, right? So which play a role in terms of where the judiciary will stand, or how widespread or limited the impact of judicial review is going to be. Number one is the political history and identity of a country, right? So then I talked to you guys about how the courts in many post-colonial states tend to be very expansive in their interpretation. One of the contexts for that is that for a very long time, these territories essentially were denied their basic rights, and didn't essentially have fundamental rights altogether. So in the Indian subcontinent, the citizens had no fundamental rights until after partition or after independence, when each country came up with its own constitution, which provided fundamental rights to the people, right? Another important thing, essentially, which often gets ignored, is the religious identity of a state. So a state could be secular, or it could have a religious identity. Even within secular states, you have a whole range. You could be secular, more like the US is right now. The idea that religions, association to religion or religious thought, even though it's not state ordained, but still plays a great role in their socio-political and legal discourse. So, even if you look at the protests pertaining to abortion rights, if you talk about, legality of same-sex marriage, all of these things, the core arguments for, like on one side at least, were coming from religion, right? You still can't envisage in the United States having a president, for that matter, who just is openly atheistic, even though, again, it's a secular state, because the mindset of the people also sort of plays a very heavy role into that. Then you could also have a religious state more like France, or other similar countries situated in mainland Europe, where the religious associations are actually sort of somewhat frowned upon by the state, right? You have the burqa ban, and similar situations going on in many countries. So even within secular states, how the state actually treats religion varies. And why do I link this with judicial review? Because these disputes end up coming to the courts anyway, right? So how is the court actually going to interpret or resolve this particular dispute? Sure, they have a law in place. What credence or what association they're going to or what sanctity they're going to associate to that particular law? Are they going to try to wiggle their way out of it and declare it illegal? Are they going to change the interpretation somehow? Are they going to grant rights? Are they going to take away rights? So religion essentially plays a strong role there. And then, of course, if you have a religious identity as a state, like Pakistan does, Bangladesh does, many other, Malaysia does. So in these countries, then you also have a notion of for example, the Pakistani Supreme Court does this often. It derives the roots of judicial review from Islamic law, from Sharia. The idea that judicial review, the concept of judicial review in some form existed at the time of the Prophet when Islam was being established, and they you sort of use and transplant that within their thinking as well. And then we also have in Pakistan a federal Shariat court, which is a constitutional court which deals with judicial review from an Islamic perspective, or the interpretation and application of regular law and the Sharia, right? So you have those sort of things interplay as well. Another very important factor is the composition of the court in terms of judicial review. So, I mean, I think it sort of comes more into spotlight, particularly when you're talking about the SCOTUS or the Supreme Court of the United States. Who's sitting on the bench, who's conservative, who's not, who is sitting in where the numbers fall, who are going to be your swing votes. So there's a lot of that discourse happening. So I mean, of course, political affiliation, no judge is ever going to be devoid of having biases in political affiliations, right? I don't mean political affiliations that they're actively members of a particular political party, but just everybody of course has a mind which they apply, and they're going to have certain beliefs, certain notions that they do aspire by, right? And those things also factor in. But more than that, so in addition to that, actually, I think the gendered element of the composition is often ignored. So for a very long time, the judges used to be all men. And now, over a period of time, you've seen more and more women joining the judiciaries around the world. But what's still actually very much lacking is gender non-binary people, or the third gender, essentially joining benches or becoming part of the top tier judiciaries, persons with impairments essentially becoming part of the top tier courts. So these things essentially also play a role. And just to sum it all up before I finish the session, is again coming back to the notion of separation of powers, but from the perspective of judicial appointments. So that's really important as well. How the judges of the top tier courts are actually appointed is intrinsically linked to the independence that particular judicial body can exercise. Are they being appointed? Are they being elected? Are they being nominated by certain political affiliates or members of the executive or the legislature? Is it a mixture? So again, those things will inevitably have a bearing on how that particular judge behaves once they essentially come to power. And on that note, I will end my talk.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Marva. Great insight. I think I can't stress enough as to how many lectures I've attended where I've had Lord Denning drilled in. But apart from that, I mean, a great insight into obviously Pakistan's constitution and, so many other things that interlink. See, technically, although we kind of have our own laws and everything, at the end of the day, language is the basis, as you emphasized. Language is the basis, and it links all the countries together in some way or the other. So I completely echo that. And I believe we have some questions here as well. I know me and Harris definitely have some questions for you as well, so get ready.
I'm very ready.
Yeah. And I think it's definitely boosted, as for me, and I agree, I think everyone else will agree as well, that's boosted our constitutional awareness rather than commercial awareness, which is what the usual buzzword is in the legal industry. So it's definitely boosted our constitutional awareness. So thank you for that. So Harris, would you like to start off with your question?
Yeah, actually, this question was asked by one of the participants. Hassan Ali asked that how can we establish judicial review at the lower courts? For instance, the courts in Pakistan, the district courts in Pakistan.
Okay, so judicial review actually, so I know I focused mostly on constitutional courts during the lecture, but it was also because of the paucity of time, right? Because it's a very, very broad subject. Judicial review does exist at the level of the lower courts as well. In terms of, for example, on the criminal side, all your dealings with the police, the prosecutors' roles, these are things that your judges do actively, are actively involved in. Sometimes they order the police to carry out the investigation properly. If they're not, doing the job correctly, if they've arrested somebody or detained somebody with, and they have no legal reason for it. So they sort of tell them that you need to let that person go, or produce them in front of the magistrate or whatever, depending on the country you're from. So all of these things essentially form the judicial review, because they are ordering or mandating the state functionaries, other state functionaries, to behave in a certain way. You can also sort of say there's an internal judicial review or concept of that, which is of course appeals and review petitions that happen within the judicial system, where higher court judges are looking at the functionality of lower court judges. So judicial review, and even on the civil side, for example, you have revenue courts and tribunals, you have labor courts, you have consumer courts. And many of these, essentially, the state essentially is party to various types of issues within these courts, even family courts, right? So in banking courts, the SSCP is generally involved there. So if you have a state functionary or a state agency which is party to the case, it generally will involve certain form of judicial review. So the idea of judicial review is actually restricted in many areas to the idea that it's between the judiciary and the state, and it's not exercised against private persons. But in the top courts, of course, that area has sort of expanded a little bit as well. It's a little murky at the level of top. Yeah.
Lavanya, you can please go ahead with the question.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So actually, I think Haris, I think you had one as well. So I think it would be better maybe if you start off with your question and then I can just follow up with mine.
Okay. So Ms. Marwa, you have stayed at the position of article editor at Harvard Human Rights Journal, right?
Yeah.
How would you describe this experience? Did that inspire you for the idea of Lum's Law Journal?
Okay, so no, the Lum's Law Journal inspired me for that. So I actually started the Lum's Law Journal when I was in my final year at Lum's, actually. So I was still in my undergrad. So that's when we started it. And actually, I've been associated with the journal since, even after I graduated. I sort of couldn't let go. I have a thing for journals, I guess. So when I went to the States for my master's, then I joined the Harvard Human Rights Journal as an article editor. Actually, I'm also sort of the country editor for the South Asia Law Journal now. So I have 2 functional current journals, but 3 overall. I think it's a very exciting process because it's also excruciatingly painful, to be honest, not to lie to you guys in a recorded session, but because of course going meticulously over, every line and every sentence and every comma 27 times, it can be a pain. And sometimes you just start seeing all the punctuation on the walls. But I think it's a wonderful learning experience, especially if you're younger and you're just starting out, because the sheer amount of content you get to read and all the, then you have to sort of line check everything and check all the sources. And I got really excited by all the things I got to read just because of being part of all the, seeing all the entries that I was receiving and everything. So yeah, it's a good learning process. Even right now, of course, when you're starting off, these things are very new. But then I think after a while in the field, you sort of get more bogged down with what your specific areas of specialization, and you sort of start ignoring other areas which you once also loved. So I think it's a good blend that you still stay connected to all these other things as well, and it's not that I'm just completely in a sort of a pigeonhole situation.
Perfect. Sorry, Harris, what were you going to say? Sorry.
No, you can go ahead.
Yeah, so just leading on from that, so I had a question more so it's helpful for students. Mm-hmm. So what would your sort of tips and tricks, I guess, be for students who are obviously interested in this sort of area and who want to branch out career-wise? So what sort of advice do you have for these rising stars of the legal industry?
In terms of journals or just like academia in general?
Yeah, it could be both, a mix of both. Yeah.
Okay, so I think, if you're a law student, then you would probably already be comfortable with the idea that you have insane amount of readings to do, something that my students cry about a lot. And then I just say, listen, you chose the wrong major if this is not something you're happy with. So I think the first thing you need to do, and I think this applies across the board, if you improve your reading speed, That's really going to make your life a lot easier. So that's number one, and then you can, you know, like get through a lot more things more quickly, and then still have free time to binge watch seasons on the side, because that's that is a guilty pleasure. But in addition to that, I think it's also it's about sort of keeping your mind open as well. I think in that sense, what I mean is critical thinking is really important, not taking things on face value, because I feel that a lot of one of the issues that I feel, particularly within the legal fraternity within Pakistan, is that they can be, you know, and it might be true elsewhere as well. People can be very myopic in terms of their own dogmas and beliefs. And I think particularly if you're from the legal profession, you what regardless of what your personal beliefs are, if you don't have the ability to think from the other person's perspective, you actually are going to be missing out. You won't be able to file a proper plaint or a petition, even if you can't even foresee what the other side is going to come up with, right? So you need to have that sort of breadth in your thought. That's also very, very important if you go into academia, or in terms of, you know, if you want to have an editorial position, because you need to make sure that all the arguments that have been brought, I mean, regardless of what the final outcome is or the final decision that's being taken, you need to see if everything that was covered was comprehensive or not. So it's that. So, you know, just like keep your eyes open to different experiences also, because the more variety of experiences you have in life, the better essentially outlook I personally feel that a person end up having. Yeah, reading of course is very important, but yes, that goes without saying.
I think that's a never-ending scenario, isn't it?
Yeah.
We all get hooked onto that, and books after books after books. But yeah, I mean, that's just never-ending. But I guess in a way, I think it's all about, I mean, the key is to putting the, like you said, you know, looking at both perspectives. It's really important. That's when you can actually have a sound, sort of good, solid understanding. And that's when you can then act upon it. So I completely echo that. We actually have a rather long question in the
Yeah,
chat.
I just
So
I just saw that.
yeah, so let me just head on to that. So we have that, that's from Mohammed. As Mrs. Khan said, the executive needs to have a certain degree of flexibility to run the day-to-day affairs of the country. Considering how the courts are increasingly getting involved in the affairs of the government, is this flexibility perhaps compromised? If yes, how does that bode for the role of the government? Is the government being reduced to a ceremonial role, which cannot do anything until and unless it receives the judge's consent? So what are your thoughts on that, Marva?
Yeah, so I think this is more in the context of Pakistan, if I'm not wrong, because this is a very pressing
Yeah,
issue.
Pakistan, yeah.
Absolutely. So if it's a very pressing issue in the country right now, and it has had, I mean, it has had definitely had a chilling effect on state functionaries. So, you know, the state officials essentially being very afraid that if something's not exactly straightforward, or if there's no past precedent on the particular issue, they just wouldn't want to do that, just in the fear of not essentially, you know, being called to court later on, and, you know, sort of being dragged through all of that media trial that sort of ensues with the court trial these days. So that definitely is an issue. But I think the two areas where this is more deep rooted, so if you remember in the beginning I talked about like two different bifurcations of judicial review, of the legislature and then the executive, and within the executive I also talked about the top echelon versus the judicial review against administrative decisions. So this has had an impact, particularly number one, on the parliament's function, because we've had in Pakistan two sitting prime ministers removed by the Supreme Court of Pakistan. So that's essentially quite an anomaly if you compare it to the system, in other parliamentary systems in the world. So that's definitely has had and of course the subsequent interference in constitutional amendments has had definitely an impact on the legislature. The other area, I wouldn't say that the executive has become redundant altogether, nor has the parliament become redundant. But of course, the parliament has sort of, you know, now sort of taken a step back in that sense. But the within the executive, it's the administrative aspect that's essentially received the brunt of the force. It's not the top tier echelons who essentially have been on the receiving end of all these judicial review actions or the intervention that's happening from the judiciary. So I wouldn't say that, you know, the judiciary is certainly not all in power right now, but the judiciary has acted time and again as an agent of the top tier executive, not again the administrative aspect. So I would essentially see this as the judiciary working in cahoots, or sort of, sometimes, not all, of course, furthering the interests of the top tier executive. Um, and so, but that's also part of the government. So it's essentially the lower bit of the administrative bit of the executive, and the parliament, or just the legislature, that's seen the brunt of it. But even the provincial legislatures have not been as affected as the parliament, by the way. So there's also a bifurcation there.
Great. So I know Shivani has a question for you, the founder, our lovely founder. So, Shivani, without further ado, would you like to ask?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much. That's really sweet of you. And so, yeah, Marwa, I have a question for you, which is similar to what Ayush has asked in the chat. Is he had asked the question, what tips would you give to Harvard aspirants? And I'd like to add on to that, asking, you also received a Fulbright scholarship, right?
Yes.
So, how academically oriented were you?
That's an interesting conversation.
It's a toughie, isn't it?
So the thing is, I mean, okay. So in terms of, just like getting securing an admission in universities abroad, there's a difference between the UK and the United States, in the sense that in the UK, many universities are still very much fixated on what your GPA is and those sorts of metrics. In the US, it's not just that. You could have, let's say, an average GPA, but if your application otherwise is strong, or you have reasons to explain why your GPA sort of fluctuated, I mean, you could have been going through like a personal issue or whatever. So I mean, they sort of look at your application holistically, which is also true for Fulbright. So they will, I just admitted to one guilty pleasure, which was binge watching, right? But in addition to that, so when I was in school, I was in a lot of clubs, like I was in the choir and the
It's
debating
not
club.
night clubbing, guys, just to let you know.
No,
It's not
no,
night
not
clubbing.
not the party clubs, no. but charity society, those sorts of things. During my undergrad, however, I think I was more involved in activities which were law oriented. So LUMS, of course, has many disciplines and a wide variety of student societies. I restricted myself to more law oriented activities. So we had the Law and Politics Society, which was something that was, like they had annual moots, and that mooting just generally, like, those are the sorts of competitions I did partake in. I also then had the journal to add. In addition to that, I also worked as a research assistant. So again, when you're applying, one of the things that you need to factor in is what sort of graduate study do you want to do. Do you want to go on the practitioner side, or do a sort of what's called as a, or referred to as a practitioner's LLM, or go for an academic LLM? My target was always the academic LLM, so my activities, of course, were more focused in that area. So like more research, more writing, that sort of thing. I've also had some internships, but again, they were a very small part of my CV, I feel. On the other hand, if you want to, let's say, aim for a practitioner's LLM, then you should essentially have more field experience. So go for more internships, different internships. If you don't like one place, it's fine. You can also leave it. I mean, it's not the end of the world. That's the one upside of being an intern. You could, sort of go to another place. Another thing I would suggest is get a wide variety of experiences while you're still a student, because you can. I mean, as a student, you can intern in a family law firm at one point, and just the next day go to a commercial law firm, and then a more human rights sort of a project or an NGO, all those sorts of things. So that's, I think, the first sort of bifurcation you should have. If you're confused which side you want to go on, that also happens a lot. Then just do a blend of both. Have a bunch of internships to your name, and then also engage in some form of, you could write for a journal, you could write for a blog. Law blogs are really taking off right now. So that's another idea, so those sorts of things I think really factor in, because the university wants to see how serious you are, or even, when you're applying for scholarships, they want to see how serious you are for that particular thing, right? And with every passing day, I feel that these avenues are becoming more competitive, because there's now a lot more people applying for the same positions as opposed to, let's say 10, 15 years ago. and everybody now, like, doing a master's essentially has become the new norm. It's the new undergrad, basically. For our parents, it was a big thing if they had done an undergrad. Right? So that's sort of a situation. So I think, just like some level of seriousness, it doesn't have to be completely nerdy though, some form of activities to show that you are serious about what you're applying for. And if you haven't been able to do these things during your undergrad or during your law degree, then you still have time. So you can just take some time, work for a bit in the relevant area. Like if you want to do a practitioner's master's, you go to a law firm, work there, and that will actually really build onto your CV as well, right? So it's not, so you can always build on your CV. It's not that, oh, once you've graduated, this is the end and now life is over. It's just getting started. So, I think the same principle applies on both fronts, in terms of scholarships and in terms of securing university admissions as well.
Great. We've actually got a question from one of our core team members in International Legal League. So obviously we know the importance of critical thinking and analysis as a skill. So she was asking, what's the best way of actually improving that skill? With some people, it's a very hard skill to grasp. It takes a bit of time. With some people, it's
lost your voice for a little bit. Yes, could you speak?
Better now? Yeah.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah.
This is what happens when you have, you're in a remote working world, the daily routine.
Absolutely.
So she was just basically asking, how do we go about improving that skill? Through either opportunities. Through opportunities or through other means, basically, because it's very hard to grasp with some students. Some people pick it up quickly because everyone is an individual at the end of the day. So how would you go about doing that?
Okay, so just if you want to start off, I think there's some very fun exercises if we're starting off with the very basics, and I think that is the right point. So you'll find some very fun exercises to do online as well. So if you just Google critical thinking exercises or activities, you'll find a few. But I think more than that, if you just start paying attention to what you're saying in daily discourse, that really helps. So, if you said something as a matter of fact, or if you have a strong opinion about something, or just an opinion about something, there might be things you have no opinion about, right? But for each thing, you need to know why you say something that you do, or why you feel in a particular way about a particular issue. So is it stemming from your personal experiences? Is it stemming from, let's say, religion or some social norms, whatever it is? So for example, I've also had the experience of teaching at the Punjab Judicial Academy for a while last year. And, so critical legal thinking essentially is one of the topics we were discussing there. And, when we're talking about implicit biases, this, like some of the judges were, very candid, and they actually opened up by saying that, there's one judge who had experienced, like a sort of traumatic robbery when they were younger. Every time a robbery case came in front of them, they always give the higher end of the sentence, essentially, because judges generally have a range within which they can assign a sentence, right? So others essentially might just feel sympathetic towards, let's say, if somebody is an accused and there's a sore blood runner because they had been in that situation, so on and so forth. You can have gender biases. So the thing is that I think insight into yourself, sort of critically analyzing why you behave a certain way in certain situations that differently. I think getting to know yourself, which is of course the most difficult part, I think, is crucial. So you can always take up these like online activities, and once you think that you're getting the hang of it, then start analyzing everything. Start analyzing what other people say as well. It can be very annoying for them, but maybe just do it internally if you're not too good of friends. If they're saying something, why are they saying them? Is there a context? Is this something they've just read from somewhere now and just like throwing it around? Do they have an experience that might feed into what they're saying? Is their experience should their experience actually be different, or have resulted in a different ideology from what they're actually positing? These are all very sort of subtle things that it takes a while to sort of get a hang on. And I'm not claiming to be the master of all of this, but I think these are just like daily things that you can do. Sometimes you're sitting in a class and you're bored, so maybe just critically analyze that lecture. But those sorts of things, yeah.
All right. we've got a question in the chat, and I promise this is the last question because we are already over time. So Hafiza Geeta has asked the question that is judicial review necessary for all the states? I mean, I guess she wants to know your opinion upon it.
Okay. So it depends on the state. If you have an authoritarian regime, or if you are, let's say, Hafiza, if you are the dictator, you don't want judicial review. And that's so for your state, that will not be the option. So if you're coming up with a new regime, but in a democracy, judicial review is absolutely essential, because again, you cannot leave the executive or and the legislature just completely unchecked and wreak havoc in any manner they deem fit, right? So as a citizen, even if it's not amongst each other, I mean, there was a question earlier about how the powers of the legislature and some of the executive have been reduced because of judicial review. But at the same time, the judiciary has also been sort of protectionist of people's rights, right? So as a citizen, if you're coming from that mindset, as a citizen, it's essential to have judicial review, so that there is some body or some forum that you can go to once if and when your rights are contravened. So from that perspective, I mean, from every perspective, personally, I feel it's essential. But also from the, so that's one, and just from the concept of separation of powers, and even the tussle that I've managed. I mean, we have a tussle right now, but that's only because the systems are evolving. The systems aren't that old, as unlike the United States or England, where hundreds and thousands of years old actually. So from all of these perspectives, I mean, it will take a while before the new equilibrium is reached, but once it is reached, hopefully it will be a more saner situation.
Perfect. So I think it's time to probably wrap up. I think Shivani would agree. I think Shivani's going to doze off anytime soon now.
No, I'm not. No.
I'm joking.
No.
I'm only messing. But yeah, I think so I think it was absolutely great, really great insight, honestly. I have learned quite a lot now in developing my constitutional awareness. I've not only learned about Pakistan, which I literally had no idea about, literally the history, anything, literally nothing. But I have learned so much from this session, honestly. It's been
My
great, and
pleasure.
I'm pretty sure I can talk on behalf of all the students here today. We're really grateful that you've taken out the time today to talk to all of us. I appreciate, I think it's dinner time now, is it? Is it dinner time? Or
No.
what time is it? No, oh, it's not.
Yeah,
Tea time.
Tea time, that's it. Tea time.
Yes, afternoon tea.
Yeah, so we went over tea time. But yeah, I mean, I think it's
Yeah.
been absolutely great. And I think if Harris and Shivani would like to join me in thanking Marva as well.
yes. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. And this is actually one of my
Uh,
favorite subjects. Constitutional law has always
Oh,
been one of my
wonderful.
favorite subjects. So yeah, so this is I really enjoyed listening to your talk. I really enjoyed getting to
Thank
know
you so
about
much.
all the different kinds of judicial aspects that you had to insights that you had to give us, and also of course I got to know a lot about Pakistan as well. So this was really wonderful. Thank you so much.
No, no,
Aris?
my pleasure. I think I had a
um,
wonderful experience as well.
I'm really grateful to you for joining us for today. Actually, I had heard about you in Lungs, but I didn't meet you. I never meet you personally. So I think this was the meeting. This was our first meeting, and I really enjoyed it, and honored to have you here.
Thank you so much. I think you, all of you, have been incredibly sweet. And it was an absolute delight to meet you and to get to know you as well. And I think you have a wonderful project going on. So, wishing you all the best.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was lovely
Take
having you.
Thank
care.
you. Thank you so
You're
much.
welcome.
Take care.
Thank you
And
to
Bye.
everyone who's joined today. Also, guys, do check us out on LinkedIn, Instagram, every social media platform we're in. So please feel free to check us out. Any further questions, you can drop us a line via email. And yeah, Shivani.
yes, of course. Yeah, so for the ones who we cannot take up your questions. We're really sorry because we had lack of time. But other than that, if you have anything that you would personally like to ask her, then do let us know and we can email it to her. And yes, do check us out on International Legal League. We now have a YouTube channel as well. And we have Instagram, we have LinkedIn, we have well, the WhatsApp group if you're a part of one of our team members. And of course, if you wish to join us by joining us as country ambassadors or campus ambassadors or content writers, researchers, editors, we will have the vacancies opening up really soon. So keep a lookout for that and do apply for sure. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.